You may hear the word covenant and you're like, what in the world does this even have to do? It's the feast of the presentation of Christ. We don't even use covenant on a regular basis. What do you mean? Let me tell you a story. January 18th of 2004. I remember I was a captain in the U.S. Army. I was on leave from Camp Casey, Korea, and I flew to England to go interview at seminary. And so I stopped by this local church that my brother had attended, and I knew the chaplain that worked there. And he invited me to a meal after Sunday service, and it was for all the undergrad students at the university. And I met this amazing lady that, like, we started talking, like, oh, wow, you go to Stetson, that's really cool. And then, oh, wait, my aunt went to Stetson. And then we had another story, which was like, hey, you speak Spanish. That's really cool. I speak Spanish too. So we really connected. It was a great sort of moment. I flew back to Camp Casey, Korea. I was like, that was a really memorable, conversation I had. About 6 months later, I show up at seminary, and this lovely lady that I met is there. And I said, hey, Michelle. And she looks at me, she says, do I have a name tag on? She doesn't remember meeting me at all. Clearly, it wasn't that memorable. But now she remembers, so every January 18th, she takes me out for a date, just to say, let's remember that date, even though I forgot. But the point is, okay, so we met, and then a year and a half after that, we got engaged, and then we got married, and we entered into this thing called covenant. It's kind of crazy, but there's very few things that we have in our modern day and age that are covenants. We have contracts, we have prenups, we have lots of agreements, we have letters of understanding and memorandums of agreement, but very few things in our day and age are covenants. But in the words of Reverend Alec McTeer, who was an amazing Bible historian, amazing professor of Hebrew, and was the principal of Trinity College in Bristol, England, he said, it is impossible to understand the Bible unless you understand the idea of covenant. So today is a day in which we celebrate the presentation of Christ in the temple. It's a day in which people in the Jewish community, 40 days after a child is born, and that started many, many years ago, all the way back in the book of Exodus. It was told they had to do this, and they've continued doing it all the way into this day and age. So on the 40th day, a woman will be reintroduced into society, into the full Jewish community, and if it's a firstborn male, quoting what you read Simeon saying, it says that every firstborn who opens the womb, in other words, every firstborn that is born shall be devoted to the Lord. Ours said, shall be called holy to the Lord. But devoted means that the child doesn't belong to you. The child belongs to God. And so if you've ever had a Jewish friend and gone to one of these ceremonies for their firstborn child, you'll go there and the dad and mom will bring $5 silver and they'll give them to the Cohen. The idea, and you're like, that's a bit strange and weird. Well, do you know where this idea even comes from? It comes from an idea of covenant. Because covenant is three things, and that's what we're going to unpack today. God promises, God acts, and we respond. So God has dealt with human beings throughout history in covenants. That's the way he relates to us. He promises to us, he acts, and then we respond. We either accept or reject the covenant. So God called Abraham in chapter 12. God, just 2 chapters prior to that, is calling Noah in a covenant and establishes a covenant with Noah. God establishes a covenant with David, saying, I will build your house forever. Then in the book of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, God says, I'm establishing a new covenant in which I'm no longer going to just write laws on stone tablets, but I'm going to write it on your heart. Behold, my messenger, the covenant, is coming to you, and he will declare the word of the Lord. So covenant. But how did they ratify this covenant? The idea was that God made a covenant with Abraham. He said, I'm going to make you a very large father of many nations. And God promises that. And so Abraham's like, okay, you promised, I'm waiting. And the interesting thing is that it takes quite a few years, and Abraham and Sarah struggle with infertility. They can't have kids. And finally, when they do get a kid, they get Isaac, which Yitzhak literally means laughter in Hebrew. So if you were walking around Israel like, hey, how you doing, Isaac? You're saying, hey, Chuckles, come over here. But the point is that they find God's promise so outlandish, outrageous, and ridiculous that when it finally comes to it, it's like, we're going to have to call our son Chuckles. God promises that he's going to give them Isaac, and then he acts. And then here's the thing. The reason why to this day, in 2025, people still practice Bidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn, is because of this. Abraham and all other people in the surrounding cultures 1,800 years prior to Christ, in the ancient Near East, they understood that if your local deity demanded something of you, you did what your local deity asked you. So if Bel-Marduk told the Babylonian king, I want this, or if Chemesh asked this of the Canaanites, I want your firstborn son, they didn't bat an eyelash of it. But something radical happens, and this is what most theologians will tell you. If you're just a regular student of theology, there's something radical that forever changes the way people worship God in the world. And it's called the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And God goes to Isaac. He says, you know what? I promised you I'd make you a father of many nations. I want your firstborn. The earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. Everything's mine anyway. Give me your firstborn. And so Abraham, he grew up in Ur of the Chaldees. You know what? Here's the thing. This is a picture of grace, the covenant of grace, right? Did you know that the first Jew was actually a Gentile? God calls a Gentile and makes him part of his covenant people. So he has this overture of grace, and he says, look, Abraham, give me your firstborn. And Abraham was used to it. He'd seen his neighbors do it. There's archaeological evidence that when the king of Jericho dedicated his city, what did he do? Took his firstborn son, sacrificed him, put him at the gates and the pylons of the gate of Jericho. There's nothing weird about it. Child sacrifice has been practiced by many, many cultures. But for the first time, breaking into human history, God tells Abraham, give me your son, Isaac. And he goes, okay, you want child sacrifice? Everybody else is doing it. I want to be with the cool kids. So he takes his son, and he says, we got to go offer sacrifice to God. So they pack up the mule, they put on firewood, he gets his knife, and Abraham and Isaac go walking up Mount Moriah. Interestingly enough, Mount Moriah, most historians and archaeologists will tell you, is actually located, it's one of the hills. There's Mount Zion, there's Mount Moriah, and that's in Jerusalem nowadays. People believe that where Mount Moriah is, it's somewhere near where the Temple Mount is. And God says, give me your son. You know, Isaiah 61 or, Route 61, where do you want that killing done? God said to Abraham, give me your son. And Abraham goes, and he doesn't bat an eyelash. And as they're walking, Isaac turns to Abraham. He says, we've got the wood, we've got the knife, we've got the fire. Where are we getting the sacrifice from? And Abraham is torn up inside. He said, if I tell him, he's going to resist, he's going to run away. I mean, someone at the 8:30 service told me, you should tell this joke, that archaeological evidence points that the reason why we know that he wasn't a teenager, and he was probably younger than a teenager, is that if he were a teenager, he wouldn't have even hesitated once at killing him, rebellious teenagers. But anyway. But the point is that Isaac looks at his dad. His dad doesn't tell him what's happening, but Isaac knows something's off. And Abraham says, don't worry, son. God will provide. And he's praying and hoping maybe God will change his mind. And so he gets up to Mount Moriah, he binds his son, puts him on the altar. And as he raises his hand to plunge into his son in sacrifice, an angel stops his hand, and the Lord provides a ram instead of the son, instead of Isaac. So the reason why Mary and Joseph go to the temple, they're doing the redemption of the firstborn. And so they're going to go redeem him. And there's young man or old man, we don't know his age, Simeon, who hears that. He knows that God had promised that the Messiah would come. And they'd waited. And they'd waited and they waited for the consolation of Israel. But they knew that before the consolation of Israel would come around, the woes of Israel would come around, the hardships, the difficulties and the strains. But here's the thing, God doesn't just promise in covenant, God acts. Think about the covenant that God makes with Moses, right? I said God made a covenant with David, God made a covenant with Noah, God makes a covenant with Abraham. God makes a covenant with Moses and the people of Israel. But how does that covenant work? And this is how every other covenant that God makes with us works. He doesn't say, look, I'm going to give you these 10 rules. You follow the 10 rules, I'll get you out of slavery. That would be a covenant of works. God establishes a covenant of grace. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of bondage of slavery in Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. It's grace. He gets him out of slavery. Then he says, what's your response? God promises, then God acts, and then finally our response. How do we respond to these overtures of grace? What is amazing about this story is that Jesus is tiny. He's just a little baby. He's come there with Mary. And as we read in Hebrews, it says that Jesus was like us in every way. That's what our text today said. He was like us in every way, tempted and tried and tested, and he shared in our humanity. He became fully one of us, not just like us, but fully one of us. I'm not sure if you saw, tucked into the text, it says that Mary and Joseph offered some pigeons. And the text in Luke actually cuts the verses that we find in the Torah down. But it says this, it says that when your firstborn is born, you must redeem them, and you can offer a lamb, or if you're not rich enough, you can offer a pigeon or 2 turtle doves. The whole point is the God of the universe who invented and made this whole universe, and every vein of gold in this planet is his, made himself poor and became one of us. So poor that his parents actually offered the cheapest and poorest sacrifice because they couldn't afford a lamb. Jesus identifies with us, not just in our pleasures, but also in our pain by becoming one of us. And it says this, St. Paul says, God made him who knew no sin that we might become the righteousness of God. The whole point of the story of Isaac, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is that a lamb died instead of Isaac. And just as Jesus goes to the temple and he's redeemed because he's dedicated to God, Jesus is the firstborn who gives himself in our stead so that no other sacrifices should ever be necessary. No more human sacrifices, no more animal sacrifices, because this is the one, to use the old Rite One language, the full, perfect, sufficient oblation and satisfaction to God. Jesus is that firstborn who has redeemed us, and he has taken our place. So on this feast of the presentation of Christ, what's the so what? I said God acts, God promises, God acts, and then we respond. When I asked my wife to marry me, we went up on the London Eye, got down on her knee, and I popped the question. And I said, look, would you like to enter into covenant with me? And you know, sometimes we like to hedge our bets. You can go yes, no, or maybe. Have you ever tried being maybe married? Have you ever tried maybe entering into covenant? It just doesn't happen. Our response to the overtures of grace is either yes or no. And Simeon puts it right there in your face. This gentleman, this little baby boy you're holding, he says to Mary, a sword will pierce your heart. And he's destined for the rising and the falling of many. You're either going to say yes to this covenant, or you're going to say no, thank you. But the covenant of grace is this. Long before you ever knew and loved God and did anything for him, he knew and loved you and called you by name, gave his life for you. So here's the response I want you to kind of think of today. There's always a so what to sermons. You know what one of the Latin words for covenant is? Sacramentum. So when you come up to this rail, you're not just getting a little bit of bread and wine. It's a covenant renewal ceremony. You're renewing that loyal pledge of love from God to you, and you're renewing that back. Maybe you don't feel comfortable coming forward to do that. That's fine. You can just stay in your seat or cross your arms across your chest. The other thing you can do is, there's an easy thing you can do just in the silence of your heart. You can say something that I teach my 5-year-old to say: sorry, thank you, and please. Sorry, Lord, for the things that have separated me from you and from my neighbor. Thank you for sending Jesus to be that lamb that takes my place. Please, will you come into my heart by the power of your Spirit? So, Father, we ask today, as we come forward to receive communion, may we renew our covenant with you as you have renewed your covenant with us. Amen.